At 7:42 a.m., a homeless old man carrying a cardboard coffee tray was publicly humiliated outside one of the most powerful companies in America. Security laughed at him. Employees mocked him. One executive even threatened to call the police. But what nobody inside that building knew was that this homeless man had secretly purchased the entire company just 48 hours earlier. And before the day was over, careers would be destroyed, secrets would be exposed, and one executive would beg for forgiveness on his knees.
Richard Vale had spent most of his life building an empire powerful enough to buy skyscrapers, politicians, and entire companies without ever stepping into a room. Yet on a freezing rain-soaked morning in Manhattan, the 68-year-old billionaire stood alone outside Titan Global Holdings wearing a stained brown coat, worn-out boots, and a faded wool hat that barely covered his gray hair. In his trembling hands sat a cheap cardboard tray carrying coffee cups that were already turning cold in the winter wind. People brushed past him like he was invisible. Some wrinkled their noses. Others laughed quietly while avoiding eye contact. At exactly 7:42 a.m., a security guard shoved him backward toward the sidewalk, while several employees standing near the revolving doors burst into laughter. One young analyst even pulled out his phone to record the humiliation, while another muttered that people like him were ruining the city. Richard lowered his eyes and apologized softly, playing the role perfectly. But what nobody standing in front of Titan Global Holdings knew was that the old man they mocked had secretly purchased the entire company just 48 hours earlier. And before the sun set over Manhattan that evening, careers would collapse, hidden crimes would surface, and one powerful executive would fall to his knees begging the same man for mercy. The rain continued falling as black SUVs rolled silently through midtown traffic several blocks away, their drivers waiting for a single phone call that would change everything inside Titan Global Holdings forever. Employees hurried through the lobby carrying expensive briefcases and designer coffee cups, completely unaware that their lives were already beginning to unravel. Richard stood quietly near the entrance, studying every face that passed him. Some ignored him. Some insulted him openly. But a few looked nervous the moment they noticed him staring too long. It was almost as if certain people inside that building recognized something familiar in his tired blue eyes. Richard noticed everything. The impatient executive screaming at assistants over the phone. The exhausted janitor cleaning floors while being mocked by younger staff. The frightened receptionist who forced herself to smile even while clearly terrified of making mistakes. For Richard, this day was never about pretending to be poor for entertainment. It was never about testing kindness or humiliating arrogant employees online like some billionaire social experiment. He came back to Titan Global Holdings because 22 years earlier, someone inside that building stole his future, destroyed his reputation, and buried a secret so devastating that it changed the course of his entire life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why Richard Vale returned to Titan Global Holdings disguised as a homeless man, you have to go back to 1998, long before private jets, billion-dollar acquisitions, and magazine covers turned him into one of the richest men in America. Back then, Richard was just another exhausted worker trying to survive inside the lower floors of Titan's old shipping facility in Brooklyn. He worked night shifts cleaning equipment and repairing damaged cargo containers while executives upstairs earned bonuses worth more than his yearly salary. Richard never complained. Men who worked beside him described him as quiet, disciplined, and impossible to intimidate. While others wasted time smoking outside loading docks, Richard stayed late studying supply chain reports left behind in empty offices. He taught himself logistics, management systems, and transportation economics using outdated manuals thrown into storage rooms. Nobody paid attention to him because nobody believed a maintenance worker could understand business better than executives wearing tailored suits upstairs. But Richard understood something the executives did not. Titan Global Holdings was slowly collapsing under corruption, greed, and reckless leadership. Millions of dollars were disappearing from company accounts every quarter, while dangerous safety violations were ignored to protect executive bonuses. Workers suffered injuries that never appeared in official reports. Entire departments were manipulated to hide financial losses from investors. Richard saw everything because invisible people always see the truth first. Executives rarely notice janitors standing quietly in hallways or maintenance workers fixing elevators during private conversations. Richard became a ghost inside the company, overhearing secrets powerful men assumed nobody else would ever discover. And eventually, one name kept appearing at the center of every suspicious decision inside Titan Global Holdings: Daniel Mercer. Even before becoming senior executive director, Daniel Mercer had built a reputation for ambition that frightened people inside the company. Tall, charismatic, and endlessly polished in front of investors, Daniel understood how to manipulate rooms filled with powerful people. He remembered birthdays, praised struggling employees publicly, and spoke about loyalty during company meetings like a politician campaigning for office. But behind closed doors, Daniel operated differently. Former workers later described him as ruthless, calculating, and obsessed with power. He crushed anyone who threatened his rise inside Titan Global Holdings. Managers who questioned accounting discrepancies suddenly disappeared from departments. Employees reporting safety concerns found themselves reassigned or fired weeks later. Richard noticed the pattern immediately. Daniel Mercer wasn't simply climbing the corporate ladder. He was removing anyone capable of exposing what was really happening inside the company. One winter night changed everything. Richard had stayed late repairing damaged equipment near one of Titan's shipping warehouses when he overheard a heated argument between Daniel Mercer and two financial officers inside a nearby conference room. Hidden behind partially open maintenance doors, Richard listened as millions of dollars in illegal transfers were discussed openly. Offshore accounts, fake shipping contracts, missing pension funds. The deeper the conversation went, the more Richard realized Titan Global Holdings was hiding fraud large enough to destroy the entire corporation if exposed publicly. Then Daniel said something Richard would never forget. He calmly explained that if anyone inside the company ever discovered the truth, they would make sure that person disappeared before investigators ever asked questions. Richard stood frozen in silence. At that moment, he understood he was listening to men capable of destroying lives without hesitation. What Daniel Mercer never realized was that Richard had quietly documented everything for months. Hidden inside old storage lockers and maintenance rooms were copies of invoices, internal memos, shipping records, and handwritten notes proving massive corruption inside Titan Global Holdings. Richard planned to expose everything anonymously to federal investigators. But before he could act, tragedy struck his life in a way that still haunted him decades later. 3 weeks after overhearing that conversation, a catastrophic explosion tore through one of Titan's Brooklyn facilities during a late-night equipment failure. Official reports blamed faulty wiring. Titan executives called it an unfortunate accident. But Richard knew better because his wife Evelyn had been working inside that building the night it exploded. And buried deep inside confidential maintenance files was proof that executives had ignored repeated warnings about dangerous equipment failures months before the disaster happened. 23 workers died that night. Daniel Mercer ensured every investigation was buried before the public learned the truth. And when Richard attempted to speak out afterward, someone leaked false accusations claiming he falsified maintenance reports connected to the explosion. Overnight, Richard lost his job, his reputation, and nearly his freedom. Titan Global Holdings buried him while Daniel Mercer climbed higher inside the company, eventually becoming one of the most powerful executives in corporate America. But Richard Vale never forgot. While the world believed he disappeared after the scandal, he quietly rebuilt his life from nothing. He started a small trucking company using borrowed money and secondhand vehicles. He worked 18-hour days for years, sleeping inside warehouses and driving routes himself across multiple states. Slowly, his business expanded. One contract became 10. 10 became 50. Eventually, Richard built one of the largest logistics companies in North America. By the time financial magazines finally discovered him decades later, Richard Vale was worth billions. Yet despite all his wealth, he remained obsessed with one thing: returning to Titan Global Holdings. Not for revenge alone, but for the truth. Because somewhere inside that building were still people connected to Evelyn's death, and Richard intended to expose every single one of them publicly. Richard Vale never spoke much about his childhood because men like him were taught early that survival mattered more than memories. He grew up on the east side of Detroit during the late 1960s in a neighborhood filled with abandoned factories, broken windows, and families struggling to keep lights on during brutal winters. His father worked long shifts at an auto plant before alcohol slowly destroyed what remained of the family, while his mother cleaned motel rooms until arthritis bent her hands permanently. Richard learned early that nobody was coming to rescue people like them. By the age of 14, he was carrying boxes behind grocery stores for cash and fixing broken machinery inside local repair shops after school. He never complained. Friends from his neighborhood later described him as quiet, focused, and strangely disciplined for someone so young. While other boys dreamed about escaping Detroit through sports or music, Richard studied trucks, warehouses, supply routes, and factory systems. He became obsessed with understanding how products moved across America because he believed transportation controlled everything: food, medicine, money, power. Even then, Richard understood systems better than people twice his age. By 23, Richard was working multiple factory jobs while sleeping inside a tiny apartment he shared with his wife Evelyn near downtown Detroit. Evelyn was the opposite of Richard in almost every way. She laughed loudly, trusted people too easily, and believed hard work eventually led to fairness. Richard loved her for that, because she saw goodness in a world that had shown him very little kindness. When Titan Global Holdings opened a major shipping facility in Brooklyn during the early 1990s, Richard convinced Evelyn they should move to New York for a better future. Titan promised stable jobs, healthcare, and opportunities for advancement. To people struggling financially, the company looked like salvation. Richard accepted a janitorial position inside the massive facility because it was the only opening available quickly. What nobody inside Titan realized was that the quiet maintenance worker cleaning executive hallways at midnight possessed one of the sharpest business minds in the building. Richard spent every spare moment studying operational systems, inventory reports, and transportation schedules left carelessly on desks after meetings. He understood immediately that Titan Global Holdings was wasting millions through poor logistics management alone. Yet while executives upstairs earned massive bonuses pretending to be visionaries, the workers actually keeping the company alive barely survived paycheck to paycheck. Years passed quietly until Richard began noticing unusual activity inside the company. Workers suffered injuries that disappeared from official reports. Entire departments suddenly changed accounting records overnight. Truck routes were manipulated to hide missing inventory worth millions of dollars. The deeper Richard looked, the more one name continued appearing at the center of every questionable decision: Daniel Mercer. Tall, polished, and endlessly confident in public, Daniel carried himself like a future politician instead of a corporate executive. He shook hands firmly, smiled constantly during interviews, and spoke about ethics during shareholder meetings while privately humiliating anyone beneath him. Employees feared him because Daniel understood how to destroy careers without leaving fingerprints behind. Managers questioning suspicious expenses suddenly found themselves transferred across the country. Workers reporting safety violations disappeared quietly from payroll records within weeks. Daniel built loyalty through fear, and inside Titan Global Holdings, fear spread faster than truth. Richard observed everything silently while continuing his janitorial duties at night. To executives, he was invisible, just another older maintenance worker pushing cleaning carts through empty hallways after meetings ended. But invisible men often hear the conversations powerful people never expect others to remember. Richard's life changed forever after a late-night equipment inspection inside one of Titan's shipping warehouses. A hydraulic system malfunction had nearly crushed 2 workers earlier that evening, and management ordered maintenance crews to repair the issue quietly before federal inspectors arrived the following week. While checking damaged equipment, Richard overheard Daniel Mercer arguing with financial officers inside a nearby conference room. Hidden behind partially open maintenance doors, Richard listened as millions of dollars in missing pension funds, illegal transfers, and falsified safety inspections were discussed openly. Then Daniel said something that stayed with Richard for the next 22 years. He calmly explained that workers were expendable, lawsuits could be buried, and poor employees rarely had enough power to fight back successfully. Richard realized Titan Global Holdings was hiding corruption capable of destroying the entire corporation if exposed publicly. From that moment forward, he secretly began collecting evidence. Copies of invoices, internal memos, maintenance warnings ignored by executives, financial records connected to dangerous cost-cutting decisions. Richard planned to expose everything anonymously before innocent workers paid the price. But before he could act, tragedy struck in the worst possible way. One freezing November night, a catastrophic explosion tore through Titan's Brooklyn facility during Evelyn's evening shift. Official reports blamed electrical failure. Executives called it an unfortunate industrial accident. 23 workers died that night, including Richard's wife. But hidden inside confidential maintenance records Richard had copied weeks earlier was proof that executives knowingly ignored repeated warnings about unstable equipment to protect quarterly profits. The explosion could have been prevented. Richard tried exposing the truth afterward, but Daniel Mercer moved quickly. False accusations suddenly appeared claiming Richard falsified inspection reports connected to the disaster. Overnight, he became the perfect scapegoat. Titan fired him publicly, while legal teams threatened criminal investigations against him if he continued speaking out. Friends disappeared. Reporters stopped calling. Richard lost everything except the evidence he managed to hide before investigators seized company records. While Daniel Mercer climbed higher inside Titan Global Holdings over the next 2 decades, Richard disappeared from public view completely. Most people assumed his life was finished. But Richard Vale rebuilt himself slowly and carefully. He started driving delivery trucks across state lines using borrowed money and secondhand equipment. He slept inside warehouses, skipped meals to save fuel money, and worked until exhaustion blurred entire weeks together. Over time, 1 truck became 5. 5 became 20. Contracts expanded. Investors noticed him. Banks that once rejected him suddenly begged to work with him. Decades later, Richard Vale controlled one of the largest logistics empires in North America, worth billions of dollars. Yet despite the wealth, private jets, and magazine interviews, he never forgot Titan Global Holdings. He never forgot Evelyn. And he never forgot Daniel Mercer. Which is why on that cold Manhattan morning, Richard stood silently outside Titan's headquarters disguised as a homeless man, while employees mocked him openly without realizing who he truly was. Inside the lobby, Head of Security Kyle Benton watched Richard carefully through narrowed eyes. Kyle was the kind of man who enjoyed power too much, especially over people unable to fight back. Former security staff later described him as aggressive, arrogant, and obsessed with humiliating homeless people who wandered near corporate properties. Kyle believed fear maintained order, and he treated struggling people like criminals by default. The moment he spotted Richard near the entrance carrying coffee cups, Kyle immediately approached him with open hostility. Employees nearby smirked while pretending not to stare. Some slowed down intentionally to watch the confrontation unfold. Kyle demanded identification before shoving Richard backward toward the revolving doors hard enough to nearly knock the coffee tray from his hands. Richard apologized quietly while keeping his eyes lowered. Kyle laughed and warned him that one more mistake would end with police dragging him off the property in handcuffs. Several employees chuckled under their breath. One woman even whispered that people like Richard made the city look filthy. But not everyone inside Titan reacted that way. Behind the front reception desk sat 26-year-old Emma Collins, one of the newest employees in the company. Unlike most executives rushing through the lobby each morning, Emma noticed details other people ignored. She noticed Richard's hands first. Despite the dirty coat and worn boots, his posture seemed disciplined, almost military. Then she noticed the watch partially hidden beneath his sleeve. It was old and scratched, but unmistakably expensive. Not flashy like the oversized luxury watches executives wore to impress clients. This one looked personal, valuable, and carefully maintained over many years. Emma also noticed something stranger outside the building. Parked discreetly across the street sat 3 identical black SUVs with tinted windows. Their drivers remained inside without moving, watching the entrance closely. And every few minutes, executives entering Titan Global Holdings glanced nervously toward the street before quickly looking away. Emma felt tension spreading through the building even though nobody explained why. Richard slowly approached the reception desk while Kyle Benton continued glaring at him from nearby security monitors. Emma offered him a nervous smile and quietly handed him fresh napkins after noticing coffee spilled across his trembling hands. Richard looked at her for several silent seconds before speaking softly enough that nobody else could hear clearly. Then he asked a question that instantly made Emma freeze where she stood. "Does Daniel Mercer still work here?" Emma Collins felt the color drain from her face the moment Richard Vale quietly mentioned Daniel Mercer's name. For a brief second, the noise inside the massive lobby seemed to disappear completely. Employees continued rushing through security gates while elevator doors opened and closed nearby, but Emma could no longer focus on any of it. She stared at the old man standing in front of her and noticed something deeply unsettling in the way he asked the question. It was not curiosity. It was certainty. Richard spoke Daniel Mercer's name the way someone speaks about a person they have carried in their memory for decades. Emma hesitated before answering carefully that Daniel was now the senior executive director of Titan Global Holdings and rarely interacted with lower-level employees unless investors were visiting the building. Richard nodded slowly as though he expected exactly that answer. Then he looked up toward the executive floors towering above the lobby and whispered something so quietly Emma almost missed it entirely. He said that some men spend their entire lives escaping consequences before finally running out of places to hide. Before Emma could respond, Carl Benton approached aggressively from across the security desk. The head of security immediately demanded to know why Richard was still standing inside the building instead of delivering the coffee and leaving. Kyle clearly enjoyed embarrassing people publicly because he spoke loudly enough for nearby employees to hear every word. He mocked Richard's appearance, accused him of smelling like garbage, and warned him not to wander around areas reserved for corporate staff. Several younger employees nearby laughed openly while pretending to check emails on their phones. One man wearing an expensive navy suit quietly recorded the confrontation with his camera, while another joked that the old delivery man looked like he had not showered in weeks. Richard simply apologized again and lowered his head slightly, remaining perfectly calm while Kyle continued humiliating him in front of everyone. Emma looked visibly uncomfortable watching the scene unfold. But inside Titan Global Holdings, very few people challenged Kyle Benton openly. He protected executives, buried complaints, and made difficult employees disappear quietly from the company within weeks. Most workers feared him more than upper management. Richard eventually picked up the cardboard coffee tray again and walked slowly toward the elevators while employees stared at him with amusement. Nobody recognized him. Nobody questioned why an elderly, homeless-looking man would continue walking deeper into one of the most restricted corporate buildings in Manhattan. That was exactly what Richard wanted. Invisible people see everything because powerful people stop paying attention once they decide someone beneath them no longer matters. Richard moved carefully through multiple departments while pretending to search for delivery instructions. Along the way, he quietly observed exhausted assistants being screamed at by executives over scheduling mistakes worth almost nothing. He watched middle managers publicly insult janitorial staff for cleaning too slowly, while expensive catered lunches sat untouched inside conference rooms nearby. In one hallway, Richard witnessed a senior executive berating a pregnant employee until she broke down crying beside a copy machine, while coworkers avoided eye contact out of fear. Every floor inside Titan Global Holdings revealed another layer of arrogance, cruelty, and fear hidden beneath polished corporate branding and smiling investor presentations. As Richard moved deeper through the building, he noticed details that immediately brought back memories from 22 years earlier. Employees still looked over their shoulders before speaking honestly. Managers still panicked whenever executives approached unexpectedly. Entire departments operated like frightened people trapped inside systems designed to protect powerful men instead of rewarding hard work. But something else caught Richard's attention almost immediately. Financial reports left carelessly on desks showed numbers that made no sense. Several shipping divisions appeared profitable publicly, while internal accounting records revealed enormous hidden losses. Entire columns had been altered manually. Expense reports connected to overseas transportation contracts were missing approval signatures completely. Richard stopped briefly beside an empty workstation and glanced through a stack of printed files left near a conference room. Within seconds, he recognized fake accounting structures designed to move money quietly between shell companies. The exact same methods Titan executives used decades earlier before Evelyn died in the Brooklyn facility explosion. Richard's expression hardened instantly. Whatever corruption once existed inside Titan Global Holdings had never disappeared. It had simply evolved into something larger and far more dangerous. Minutes later, Richard quietly passed near a partially opened executive meeting room where several senior managers spoke in low, anxious voices. One executive complained about federal auditors requesting additional documentation connected to shipping contracts overseas. Another warned that Daniel Mercer was becoming reckless and too confident after recent acquisitions expanded the company aggressively. Then Richard heard something that stopped him completely. One manager quietly mentioned payments being sent to city inspectors to prevent investigations into warehouse safety violations connected to Titan facilities in New Jersey. Another executive laughed nervously and replied that bribery was cheaper than lawsuits. Richard stood silently outside the room pretending to organize coffee cups while listening carefully to every word. The deeper the conversation continued, the more obvious it became that Titan Global Holdings was still hiding massive corruption from regulators and shareholders. Richard realized this day was no longer only about revenge for what happened to Evelyn decades earlier. Innocent workers were still being endangered by executives protecting profits at any cost. What began as a social experiment was turning into something much bigger. Richard continued toward the upper executive floors while tension inside the building slowly intensified around him. Employees whispered nervously about unexpected board activities scheduled later that afternoon. Lawyers carrying confidential folders entered private offices without explanation. Several executives looked visibly anxious after receiving phone calls they refused to discuss publicly. Meanwhile, the black SUVs outside remained parked across the street with engines running continuously. Emma Collins noticed them every time she glanced through the lobby windows. She also noticed something else. Certain executives entering the building reacted strangely whenever they saw Richard walking through different departments. Some looked confused. Others looked genuinely disturbed for reasons they could not explain. It was almost as though Richard reminded them of someone they thought had disappeared long ago. Kyle Benton eventually intercepted Richard near a restricted hallway leading toward the executive offices. Furious that the old man had somehow wandered this far inside the building, Kyle shoved him aggressively against a wall and demanded to know who authorized him to remain upstairs. Several employees nearby immediately stopped walking to watch the confrontation unfold. One woman quietly laughed while another employee pulled out his phone again to continue recording. Kyle accused Richard of trespassing and threatened to have him arrested immediately if he took another step toward the executive floor. But Richard did something unexpected. Instead of apologizing, he calmly looked Kyle directly in the eyes for the first time all morning. The expression on Richard's face changed completely. The nervous, homeless delivery man vanished instantly, replaced by someone cold, controlled, and absolutely fearless. Kyle stepped backward slightly without understanding why the old man suddenly made him uncomfortable. Then the elevator doors behind them opened. Daniel Mercer stepped out surrounded by two assistants while reviewing documents on his phone. He barely looked up at first. But the moment his eyes landed on Richard Vale standing against the hallway wall in dirty clothes holding an empty cardboard coffee tray, everything changed. Daniel froze mid-step. The color drained from his face instantly. His assistants continued speaking before realizing their boss had stopped moving completely. For several long seconds, Daniel Mercer simply stared at Richard like a man seeing a ghost return from the dead. 22 years of buried secrets, hidden corruption, and destroyed lives suddenly rushed back into his memory all at once. Richard said nothing. He only stared back silently while the hallway around them became painfully quiet. And suddenly, Daniel Mercer went pale. Mercer felt his throat tighten the moment he locked eyes with Richard Vale, standing in the hallway outside the executive floor. For 22 years, Daniel convinced himself the past had been buried permanently beneath legal settlements, falsified reports, and destroyed evidence. He spent decades building influence powerful enough to silence journalists, manipulate regulators, and erase anyone threatening his career. Yet in a single moment, all that confidence disappeared from his face completely. Richard looked older now, thinner, exhausted by life and grief, but Daniel recognized those eyes immediately. They were the same cold, determined eyes staring at him the night Richard tried exposing corruption inside Titan Global Holdings after the Brooklyn warehouse explosion killed 23 workers, including Evelyn Vale. Daniel's assistants looked confused as their boss suddenly froze in silence, while employees passing nearby slowed down to watch the strange tension unfolding in the hallway. Richard said nothing at first. He simply stared at Daniel calmly, while gripping the empty cardboard coffee tray in his weathered hands. The silence between them carried decades of betrayal, stolen success, and buried guilt that nobody else around them could possibly understand. Daniel recovered quickly because men like him survive by controlling rooms before fear becomes visible publicly. Within seconds, his polished corporate smile returned even though panic remained obvious beneath the surface. He laughed nervously and glanced around at nearby employees before asking security why a homeless man had been allowed onto the executive floor. Kyle Benton immediately stepped forward aggressively, eager to impress his boss after realizing he might have made a serious mistake allowing Richard upstairs at all. Kyle grabbed Richard roughly by the arm while apologizing repeatedly to Daniel Mercer for the disturbance. Several employees standing nearby smirked quietly while watching the confrontation continue. To them, Richard still looked like nothing more than a confused old delivery worker who wandered too far into restricted areas. Daniel looked directly into Richard's face and asked if he honestly believed sneaking into the building dressed like a beggar would somehow change the past. Emma Collins, who had followed nervously from downstairs after sensing something deeply wrong, stopped completely when she heard those words. The way Daniel spoke made it obvious these two men shared a history nobody else understood. Richard finally broke the silence quietly by asking Daniel whether he still remembered the Brooklyn facility explosion in 1998. The question instantly changed the atmosphere around the hallway. Daniel's confident expression hardened while several older employees nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Titan Global Holdings rarely discussed the explosion publicly anymore because the incident nearly destroyed the company decades earlier. Official investigations blamed faulty electrical systems and unavoidable industrial failures. But Richard knew the truth because he personally reviewed maintenance reports proving executives ignored repeated warnings before the disaster happened. Daniel tried dismissing Richard publicly, calling him unstable and bitter after all these years. But the moment Richard mentioned Evelyn's name, Daniel's composure cracked again for several terrifying seconds. Emma noticed it immediately. So did Kyle Benton. Even employees pretending not to listen suddenly stopped moving altogether. 22 years earlier, Richard Vale created the exact logistics system that saved Titan Global Holdings from financial collapse during one of the company's worst economic crises. While executives panicked over shipping failures costing millions of dollars, Richard secretly developed an entirely new transportation routing model during overnight janitorial shifts. He spent months studying supply chains, delivery delays, and warehouse inefficiencies before designing a system capable of reducing operational costs dramatically. When Richard anonymously submitted the proposal internally, Titan executives were stunned by its brilliance. But before Richard could receive recognition, Daniel Mercer stole the entire project and presented it publicly as his own work during a shareholder emergency meeting. Overnight, Daniel became the rising star of Titan Global Holdings while Richard remained invisible downstairs, cleaning hallways nobody respected enough to notice. Richard eventually confronted Daniel privately after discovering the theft, but instead of admitting the truth, Daniel retaliated viciously. He used company lawyers, false accusations, and internal investigations to destroy Richard's credibility completely. Then came the warehouse explosion weeks later. And when Richard threatened exposing the corruption surrounding Evelyn's death, Daniel made sure he became the perfect scapegoat. Standing in the hallway decades later, Daniel suddenly realized Richard was no longer the powerless maintenance worker he destroyed years earlier. Yet fear quickly turned into anger because men addicted to power often become most dangerous when exposed publicly. Daniel stepped closer and loudly accused Richard of stalking executives and trespassing inside private corporate property. His voice echoed intentionally through the executive floor so nearby employees would hear every accusation clearly. He mocked Richard's appearance again, asking whether pretending to be homeless was some desperate attempt to gain sympathy after wasting his life chasing conspiracies nobody believed. Some younger employees laughed nervously because they assumed Daniel Mercer was humiliating another unstable stranger. Kyle Benton tightened his grip on Richard's arm while preparing to force him toward the elevators. Emma tried speaking up quietly, insisting there must be some misunderstanding, but Daniel immediately silenced her with a cold stare powerful enough to terrify most employees inside the company. Richard remained calm throughout the entire confrontation. He did not defend himself. He did not raise his voice. He simply observed every person laughing at him the same way he had observed executives years earlier while they buried the truth about Evelyn's death. Then Daniel made a mistake that changed everything. Believing he still controlled the situation completely, he ordered Kyle Benton to drag Richard out of the building publicly through the main lobby so employees would understand what happens when unstable people trespass inside Titan Global Holdings. The humiliation triggered memories Richard spent decades trying to bury. 22 years earlier, security guards escorted him out of the same company after executives framed him for falsifying maintenance reports connected to the warehouse explosion. He still remembered employees watching silently while his entire life collapsed in front of them. Now history repeated itself almost exactly. Kyle shoved Richard aggressively toward the elevators while several workers nearby laughed openly and recorded the confrontation on their phones. One executive muttered that people like Richard always returned, eventually begging for attention because failure never leaves men completely. Emma followed anxiously behind while pleading with security to stop treating Richard so violently. But nobody listened to her because Titan Global Holdings rewarded obedience far more than compassion. As the elevator descended toward the main lobby, Richard stood silently between two security guards while Kyle Benton continued insulting him repeatedly. Daniel Mercer remained upstairs watching through security cameras with growing confidence, convinced the situation was finally under control again. But Richard's calm expression never changed. He looked almost relieved, as though this exact moment had been carefully planned long before he ever entered the building disguised as a homeless man carrying coffee cups. The elevator doors opened into the crowded lobby where dozens of employees immediately turned to watch security escort the old man outside. Some laughed quietly. Others pretended not to stare. Emma pushed through the growing crowd, desperately trying to intervene before things escalated further. Kyle dragged Richard toward the revolving doors while threatening to call police if he ever returned near Titan Global Holdings again. Then everything changed. Outside the building, several black SUVs suddenly pulled up directly in front of the entrance, one after another with military precision. Conversations inside the lobby stopped instantly as drivers stepped out wearing dark suits and earpieces. Employees moved closer toward the windows trying to understand what was happening. Kyle Benton loosened his grip on Richard slightly while staring outside in confusion. Even Daniel Mercer, now watching through executive security monitors upstairs, felt panic rising again the moment he recognized several members of Titan's board of directors stepping out of the vehicles unexpectedly. Then came the lawyers. Expensive tailored suits, confidential folders, armed corporate security teams, senior financial advisors. One by one, they entered the building with expressions so serious the entire atmosphere inside Titan Global Holdings shifted instantly from mockery to fear. The lobby fell completely silent when an older attorney carrying official acquisition documents walked directly toward Richard Vale without hesitation. Kyle Benton stepped backward instinctively. Employees who had laughed moments earlier suddenly looked terrified without fully understanding why. Emma watched in disbelief as the attorney stopped directly in front of Richard before speaking words that shattered every assumption inside the building forever. "Mr. Vale, the acquisition meeting is ready." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And as realization spread slowly across the faces surrounding him, Daniel Mercer's expression finally collapsed completely. His hands trembled. The color drained from his face again. Because at that moment, everyone inside Titan Global Holdings understood the horrifying truth all at once. The homeless old man they humiliated all morning now owned the entire company. And if you're enjoying this story so far, please subscribe to my channel because what happened next inside Titan Global Holdings became even more unbelievable. For several long seconds after the attorney addressed him as Mr. Vale, nobody inside the lobby moved at all. Employees who had laughed at Richard moments earlier stood frozen in silence, trying to process what they had just heard. Kyle Benton slowly released his grip from Richard's arm, as if touching him suddenly became dangerous. The same security chief who spent the entire morning mocking and threatening an elderly homeless-looking man now looked physically shaken, standing in front of one of the wealthiest businessmen in America. Emma Collins stared at Richard in complete disbelief, while pieces of the morning finally connected in her mind, all at once. The expensive watch hidden beneath his sleeve. The black SUVs parked outside for hours. The nervous executives whispering behind closed doors. Richard Vale had not wandered into Titan Global Holdings by accident. He had walked into the building already owning every office, every executive contract, every department, and every person standing inside the lobby. The old man, carrying cheap coffee cups through the rain, that morning now possessed the power to destroy careers with a single sentence. Richard slowly adjusted the sleeve of his worn coat before calmly handing the empty cardboard tray to a stunned security guard nearby. Then, without raising his voice or showing even the slightest anger, he thanked Kyle Benton for revealing exactly how Titan Global Holdings treated people without power. Those words hit the lobby harder than shouting ever could. Employees lowered their eyes in shame, while several executives near the elevators quietly backed away, suddenly terrified they may have crossed paths with Richard earlier that morning without realizing who he truly was. Daniel Mercer finally emerged from the executive elevators surrounded by lawyers and board members, but the confidence that once defined him had completely disappeared. His face looked pale and exhausted now, like a man watching decades of carefully protected lies collapse in real time. Richard looked directly at Daniel while the lobby remained painfully silent and calmly asked whether humiliating powerless people still felt entertaining now that the balance of power had changed. Daniel attempted forcing a smile, insisting there had been misunderstandings throughout the day, but nobody around him believed the performance anymore. As Richard walked through the lobby toward the executive boardroom, employees moved aside silently to clear a path for him. The same people who ignored him hours earlier now stared at him with fear, guilt, and disbelief. Some looked ashamed for laughing. Others seemed terrified about what Richard might already know regarding the company's hidden corruption. Kyle Benton remained near the security desk, unable to speak, while sweat rolled visibly down his face. Emma followed behind quietly, still trying to understand how the gentle old man she defended earlier could command an entire corporate empire without ever raising his voice once. Richard moved differently now. The hunched posture, nervous apologies, and exhausted delivery worker appearance vanished completely. Every step carried authority built through decades of discipline, pain, and patience. He no longer looked invisible. He looked exactly like what he truly was. A man powerful enough to buy the company that once destroyed his life and patient enough to wait 22 years before walking back through its front doors. Inside the executive boardroom, tension consumed every corner of the massive glass-walled space overlooking Manhattan. Board members avoided eye contact while legal teams organized stacks of confidential documents across the conference table. Daniel Mercer sat rigidly near the far end of the room, trying desperately to regain control of the situation before shareholders or federal investigators became involved publicly. Richard entered slowly without removing his old coat, intentionally forcing everyone present to remember exactly how they treated him earlier that morning. Then he calmly placed a small digital recorder onto the center of the table. One of Titan's attorneys immediately recognized it and quietly informed the room that Richard legally documented every interaction inside the building since arriving that morning. Suddenly, panic spread through several executives all at once. The insults, the threats, the employee abuse, the humiliation in the lobby. Everything had been recorded. Richard finally sat down at the head of the table while lawyers distributed folders containing financial evidence gathered during the acquisition investigation. The room grew heavier with every page turned. Hidden offshore accounts, bribery payments connected to city inspectors, safety violations buried from federal regulators, manipulated pension funds, fake transportation contracts transferring money through shell corporations. Richard calmly explained that after purchasing Titan Global Holdings through private investment groups 2 days earlier, his legal team uncovered evidence suggesting corruption inside the company extended far deeper than shareholders ever imagined. Then he looked directly at Daniel Mercer before revealing the most devastating discovery of all. For over 15 years, Daniel secretly manipulated financial reporting structures to inflate company profits artificially while diverting millions through illegal side agreements connected to international shipping contracts. Several board members stared at Daniel in horror as Richard presented transaction records carrying Daniel's personal authorization signatures. Daniel attempted defending himself immediately, arguing that Richard was acting emotionally because of personal resentment tied to events decades earlier. But Richard interrupted him calmly before explaining that revenge alone was never the reason he returned. He admitted that after Evelyn died in the Brooklyn facility explosion, anger consumed him for years. Yet over time, he realized something even more disturbing than the corruption itself. Titan Global Holdings had created an environment where cruelty became normal. Workers feared executives. Honest employees stayed silent to survive. Powerful people stopped seeing struggling human beings as deserving basic dignity. Richard slowly looked around the boardroom before speaking words that nobody inside the company would ever forget. "You didn't fail this company because you were greedy," he said quietly while staring directly at Daniel Mercer. "You failed because you stopped seeing people as human beings." The silence afterward felt unbearable. Even executives who once supported Daniel lowered their eyes after hearing those words because deep down, many of them understood Richard was telling the truth. Titan Global Holdings had become a place where profits mattered more than people for decades. Workers were disposable. Fear replaced loyalty. Compassion disappeared completely from leadership. Richard then ordered Titan's legal department to begin immediate termination procedures against Daniel Mercer while federal investigators received copies of every financial document uncovered during the acquisition process. Daniel's face collapsed entirely at that moment. The arrogance, manipulation, and confidence that protected him for years finally disappeared. He looked smaller now, older, defeated. Several board members demanded his resignation immediately, while attorneys quietly informed him criminal investigations were already being prepared. Kyle Benton's removal came next. Richard instructed HR executives to review years of employee complaints connected to abuse, intimidation, and unlawful treatment by Titan security management. Former workers who once felt powerless suddenly began speaking openly after hearing the news spread through the building. Stories emerged quickly. Employees humiliated publicly. Workers threatened unfairly. Janitorial staff treated like criminals. The culture inside Titan Global Holdings had poisoned every level of the company, and for the first time, people believed accountability might finally happen. Throughout the building, employees gathered silently around televisions and phones as rumors spread that Titan's powerful executive leadership was collapsing from inside the boardroom itself. Then Richard did something nobody expected. Instead of promoting senior executives or rewarding wealthy investors loyal to him, he asked Emma Collins to enter the boardroom. She looked terrified walking inside because she assumed she made mistakes earlier that morning by speaking up during the confrontation downstairs. But Richard smiled softly before thanking her publicly in front of the board for showing kindness to someone she believed had no power, no status, and nothing to offer her in return. Emma struggled, holding back tears while executives watched quietly. Richard explained that companies often spend millions searching for talented leaders while ignoring the simplest quality that actually matters most: character. Then he looked around the room before saying something that spread across Titan Global Holdings within minutes. Kindness reveals character when power is absent. Richard announced that Emma Collins would receive a major promotion effective immediately and personally oversee Titan's new employee ethics initiative moving forward. Some executives looked shocked by the decision, but Richard ignored them completely. He understood something many wealthy people never learn. The way someone treats powerless people reveals who they truly are long before success ever arrives. And just when everyone inside Titan Global Holdings believed the nightmare was finally ending, Richard revealed there was still one final secret connected to Evelyn's death that nobody in the room saw coming. Hours after Daniel Mercer was taken away by federal investigators and Titan Global Holdings officially announced emergency restructuring across every division, Richard Vale quietly disappeared from the attention-consuming Manhattan that evening. Reporters crowded outside corporate headquarters hoping for interviews, while financial analysts argued across television networks about the collapse of one of America's most powerful executive empires. Employees inside Titan continued whispering about the homeless old man they laughed at that morning before discovering he owned the entire company by sunset. But Richard no longer cared about headlines, public sympathy, or revenge. None of it could erase the image that remained trapped inside his memory for 22 years. Evelyn standing beside the Brooklyn warehouse during winter snowfall only days before the explosion that destroyed everything. Even after becoming one of the richest men in America, Richard never escaped that memory completely. Wealth gave him comfort. Power gave him influence. But grief remained untouched by both. Late that night, Richard asked his driver to take him somewhere he had not visited in more than 2 decades. The old Titan warehouse facility in Brooklyn still stood partially abandoned near the docks, surrounded by rusted fences, broken concrete, and faded warning signs barely visible beneath years of neglect. Developers wanted to demolish the property many times over the years, but legal complications connected to the explosion delayed every project repeatedly. Richard stepped out slowly into the freezing night air, wearing the same worn brown coat he used earlier that morning while pretending to be homeless. Snow covered the empty loading docks, where workers once unloaded cargo through endless overnight shifts. The silence there felt heavy, almost sacred. Richard walked carefully across cracked pavement until he reached the exact section of the building where the explosion began decades earlier. Most people believed Richard purchased Titan Global Holdings to become more powerful or to humiliate the executives who destroyed his life publicly. But standing alone inside that abandoned factory, Richard finally admitted the truth to himself. He never intended to remain CEO. He never wanted the company permanently. He only bought Titan Global Holdings because he needed access to buried records, hidden files, and protected executives connected to Evelyn's death. The acquisition was never about power. It was about truth. Richard slowly entered the empty warehouse while memories returned stronger with every step. He remembered Evelyn laughing beside broken vending machines during late-night lunch breaks. He remembered workers playing old radios near loading docks while trucks arrived through snowstorms. He remembered dreaming about building a better future together before greed destroyed everything around them. Titan Global Holdings fired Richard publicly after the explosion because Daniel Mercer needed someone powerless to blame before investigators started asking dangerous questions. Richard spent years believing corruption alone caused the disaster. But the final phone call he received earlier that afternoon changed everything. A retired maintenance supervisor named Walter Briggs contacted Richard after seeing news coverage of Daniel Mercer's arrest. Walter revealed he kept copies of emergency shutdown requests ignored by executives days before the explosion happened. According to Walter, the warehouse should have been evacuated immediately after dangerous pressure failures triggered multiple warnings inside fuel systems beneath the facility. But Daniel Mercer personally ordered operations to continue because shutting down production before a major investor presentation would cost Titan millions. Evelyn died because executives decided profits mattered more than human lives. Richard stood silently inside the dark warehouse while snow drifted slowly through holes in the damaged roof above him. For years he wondered whether Evelyn suffered during her final moments, whether she knew the explosion could have been prevented, whether she realized the people responsible would spend decades pretending her death was unavoidable. Richard finally understood the horrifying truth completely now. Daniel Mercer did not simply cover up the disaster afterward. He helped create the conditions causing it in the first place. That realization changed something inside Richard permanently, because revenge no longer felt satisfying after understanding the full cost of corporate greed. 23 innocent people died because powerful executives believed vulnerable workers were replaceable. Families collapsed. Children lost parents. Entire lives disappeared while Titan executives protected stock prices and bonuses from public damage. Meanwhile, back in Manhattan, Titan employees gathered quietly around televisions replaying Richard Vale's speech from earlier that day. Social media exploded with debates about wealth, class, and the way society treats struggling people. Thousands of viewers online admitted they probably would have ignored Richard too if they saw him standing outside Titan headquarters wearing dirty clothes and carrying cheap coffee cups. That uncomfortable realization became the reason Richard's story spread across America faster than anyone expected. People recognized themselves inside it. Not everyone sees corruption directly, but almost everyone has witnessed someone being judged unfairly because of appearance, poverty, age, or status. Richard exposed more than corporate fraud that day. He exposed human behavior itself. Emma Collins remained inside Titan headquarters late into the evening reviewing employee reports connected to years of abuse under Daniel Mercer and Kyle Benton. She thought constantly about the first moment Richard approached her reception desk that morning. Most employees saw inconvenience when they looked at him. Some saw weakness. Others saw entertainment. But Richard later explained something she would never forget for the rest of her life. Truly powerful people never need to announce status loudly, because character reveals itself quietly through actions. Emma realized Titan Global Holdings had spent years promoting confidence while ignoring integrity completely. That culture eventually poisoned everyone inside the company, including employees who remained silent simply to survive. Richard's return forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves they could no longer avoid. Near midnight, Richard finally reached the far corner of the abandoned warehouse where investigators recovered Evelyn's personal belongings after the explosion decades earlier. Most items were destroyed beyond recognition, but one rusted section of wall remained untouched near the original break room entrance. Richard stared at it silently before sitting alone on an old wooden crate covered in dust and snow. For the first time all day, the billionaire who exposed one of America's largest corporate scandals looked exhausted instead of powerful. He had spent 22 years chasing truth because he believed justice would finally bring peace once corruption was exposed publicly. But grief does not disappear when guilty people fall. It simply changes shape over time. Richard closed his eyes briefly and remembered something Evelyn once told him long before Titan destroyed their lives. She believed money only amplified the type of person someone already was inside. Kind people became more generous with power. Cruel people became more dangerous. Standing alone inside the empty factory that night, Richard finally understood she had been right all along. Power doesn't reveal character. It reveals who people already are. And before leaving the abandoned warehouse forever, Richard looked one final time at the building where everything changed decades earlier and quietly asked himself a question that millions of people watching his story would later ask themselves too. If someone walked into your workplace looking poor, how would they be treated? Richard Vale stood alone inside the empty executive boardroom long after federal investigators escorted Daniel Mercer out of Titan Global Holdings. Manhattan's skyline glowed through the massive glass windows while snow continued falling quietly across the city below. Only hours earlier, Employees laughed at an elderly man carrying coffee cups through the lobby because they believed appearance determined value. By the end of the day, the same man exposed corruption hidden for decades inside one of America's most powerful corporations. But for Richard, the victory never felt simple. Wealth gave him the power to return. Patience gave him the ability to wait 22 years for the truth. Yet nothing could bring Evelyn back. Nothing could erase the families destroyed by greed, fear, and silence. Titan Global Holdings spent years teaching employees that success mattered more than integrity, and eventually people stopped questioning cruelty because it became normal. Richard understood something many powerful people never learn until it is too late. The way a society treats vulnerable people reveals the truth about its character far more than speeches, headlines, or financial success ever will. Across the country, news coverage of Titan Global Holdings spread rapidly throughout the evening. Employees once terrified of speaking openly began contacting investigators with stories hidden for years. Former workers described intimidation, corruption, and abuse buried beneath polished corporate branding. Families connected to the Brooklyn warehouse explosion finally demanded reopened investigations after hearing Richard's evidence publicly for the first time. Emma Collins spent that night alone inside her apartment, trying to process how one ordinary act of kindness toward a struggling old man changed the course of her life forever. She kept thinking about Richard's words inside the boardroom. Kindness reveals character when power is absent. Those words stayed with her because she realized most people inside Titan Global Holdings never expected consequences for cruelty. They mocked weakness because they believed vulnerable people had no ability to fight back. Richard proved them wrong in the most devastating way possible. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer sat alone inside a federal holding room, watching financial news channels replay footage of his removal from Titan headquarters repeatedly. For decades, he believed power protected him permanently. He controlled executives, manipulated investigations, and buried evidence whenever problems threatened his career. But power built through fear eventually collapses because fear never creates loyalty. It only creates silence until the truth finally becomes too large to contain. Richard Vale understood that lesson better than anyone alive. He spent years rebuilding his life from nothing after Titan destroyed his reputation, and instead of allowing pain to turn him cruel, he used it to expose people who believed money placed them above accountability. That was the real reason his story spread so powerfully across America afterward. It was never only about a billionaire pretending to be poor. It was about human nature. About the masks people wear when they believe nobody important is watching them. Before leaving Titan Global Holdings that night, Richard returned quietly to the lobby where the entire story began earlier that morning. The same revolving doors still turned endlessly, while security guards stood silently near the entrance, too afraid to speak to him directly. Richard paused near the reception desk where Emma first offered him kindness, while everyone else looked away. Then he glanced toward the sidewalk outside where rainwater from the morning still reflected city lights beneath the snow. For a moment, he remembered standing there alone carrying cheap coffee cups while strangers laughed at him openly. Most people spend their lives desperate to appear powerful because they fear being ignored. Richard intentionally became invisible for one single day and discovered truths hidden behind expensive suits, corporate titles, and polished smiles. Some employees revealed compassion. Others revealed cruelty. And once people reveal who they truly are, no amount of money or status can hide it forever. Have you ever witnessed someone being judged unfairly because of how they looked? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story shocked you, wait until you hear what happened when a millionaire janitor secretly recorded his own company for 30 days. Subscribe now for more unbelievable, true inspired stories.